Welcome, foolish mortal, to another episode of the HitchHiking Hosts Show 101. I am your host, your ghost host, Wes Truth, and I am back with another episode with some more history of a Disneyland attraction for you. And we are making our way through Fantasyland now, back in Disneyland of 1955. And we've made our way to an attraction which is still there today. It's different, but it's still there in a different capacity. Not really a different capacity, but still sort of the same, but not. You'll see. This is a long show, so there's a lot of history in this one. So we're just going to get right on with it. Here is the HitchHiking Host Show 101, Snow White's Scary Adventure. First ever ride to please guests in Fantasyland is Snow White's Scary Adventures. When coming up with rides for this area of the park, dark rides or indoor rides that contain lit scenes with animation, music, and special effects was the popular way to go. A no-brainer for one of the attractions was to be based on the very successful and happened to be Walt Disney's first film from 1937, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. The ride was designed and built between 1953 and the summer of 1955. Imagineer Ken Anderson, who was one of the art directors of the film, adapted the script for the attraction and led a design team featuring Bill Martin in charge of the track layout, Herb Ryman on interior backgrounds, and Claude Coates working on the ultraviolet realization of the ride. When designing the attraction, Imagineers wanted the guest to be the main character of the story, much like Mr. Toad's Wild Ride and Peter Pan's Flight. For this ride, they would play the role of Snow White, thus the character herself would not appear. There was also much brainstorming on how the order of the scenes would go and where the witch would pop up. Like most dark rides of the era, it made extensive use of simple plywood, cutout sets, and decorations, but brought a never-before-seen touch of class to these humble creations. All of the ride's human characters, and also animals and the monster trees, were three-dimensional figures. Based on bending, sliding, rotating, or to-and-fro movements, these kind of simplistic figures have been very common in amusement park dark rides. The effects, tricks, and gags were as simple as the figures. However, in the hands of the Imagineers, these simple tricks were enhanced with dramatic staging and storytelling style. The adventure also included at least 3 pairs of crash doors that were very common in dark rides of the era. While in cheaper rides, these doors were pushed open by the vehicle itself, it is believed that from the beginning of 1955, when the ride opened, all of the crash doors of Snow White's Scary Adventures were automatically opening. The attraction was originally named as Snow White and Her Adventures and opened at Disneyland on its opening day of July 17, 1955. Disneyland's original Fantasyland was based on a medieval fairgrounds where the queue area and outside of the ride used simple but colorful canopies. These also have long murals at the loading and unloading platforms. This mural included the Diamond Mine, Forest Glade, the Seven Dwarfs Cottage, the Vultures, Witch and at the Cauldron, Dark Forest, and the Boulder Climax. The mural contained one section that wasn't a scene inside the ride, a cast portrait based on the original movie poster. The mural was originally the only time Snow White was seen at the attraction, other than an occasional cast member dressed as the character operating the ride. The original ride vehicles were called mine carts, but also resembled the dwarfs' beds from the film. Some people call them mine carts, some people call them the dwarf's bed. Either way. They were designed by Wed Enterprises and manufactured by Arrow Development. In the late 1960s, the original vehicles would be replaced by double bench versions. The vehicles also had a name of one of the 7 dwarfs on the outside of each cart. The original 1955 Snow White's Adventures started with a visit to the Seven Dwarfs Mine, where the magic of fluorescent paints under the ultraviolet lighting lit up the jewels. Guests would then reach an endless mine shaft, realized simply with a mural. Dopey, the most memorable and recognizable of the little men, peeked from behind the treasure vault's huge door. After a short visit in the treasure vault, the vehicle continued into the deepest corner of the diamond mine, where the other dwarves worked by dim lantern light. Dopey would pop up again before the vehicle left the mine, pointing to a sign reading, "Beware of the Witch." The cart then entered a brief forest scene. Cute and cuddly animals and the Seven Dwarfs Cottage were seen in the distance in the shape of a mural. The mural served as a turning point in the ride, featuring the fork in the road. Go fork yourself. Signs pointed riders to the Dwarfs Cottage and to the quote-unquote witch's castle. Of course, the vehicles headed to the castle, but of course. The atmosphere would then change as the vehicle ventured toward the castle. Among the dead vegetation of these scary woods, 2 vultures perched on a tree branch, and an ominous structure, the portcullis of the evil queen's castle, emerged from the darkness. The vultures have continued into each new version of the ride, although their appearance has changed into more cartoony direction over the decades. Passing beneath the portcullis of the evil queen's castle, which was only a painted stationary cutout, the vehicle headed straight towards another open portcullis doorway, where a clear sign pointed to the way to the dwarf's house. Without a warning, the second portcullis came down with a crash, forcing the vehicle to turn left. Oh no, you didn't! Deeper into the threatening darkness of the evil castle. The cart then passed through the deepest dungeons of the Queen's castle. Sights such as skeletons still imprisoned in their cells were included. Ghostly voices echoing from the vaults advised riders to go back. Go back! A particularly gruesome sight? My ex-girlfriend. Oh, no, sorry. A skeleton hanging chained to the back wall. stretched its neck, and opened its jaw to the direction of the arriving vehicle. The vehicle then faced a huge spiderweb in a dark archway. The silhouetted shadow of the Wicked Witch emerged behind the web and moved across the wall. In the late 1970s, the foreground of the shadow of the witch scene was changed, glowing into fire orange, with the spider possibly flicking across the web as the vehicle passed the archway. The movement of the witch's shadow was also changed. It didn't move across the wall anymore, but rocked up and down to the right, as if the witch was dipping the apple in the cauldron. As the vehicle continued its journey into another pitch-black archway, the guests sitting in the vehicle passed under a customary string gag, tickling the top of their heads, aka spiderweb feeling. The next scene showed the witch at the cauldron, poisoning the apple for Snow White. The very first figures of the Wicked Witch were scarier than what she actually looked like in the film. Riders came face to face with the hag again, this time emerging from a dark corner, behind a pillar with the apple oozing with the poison brew and forming the famous skull image. After escaping the castle, the carts ventured into a dark forest where sights such as monstrous trees with gaping mouths, glowing eyes, and branches with talon-like clutches seemed to reach out to the vehicle from every direction. The escape ended with the return to the cottage. The witch appeared in the doorway and offered the shiny red apple to riders one last time. This was followed by the climax on the steep cliffs where the witch made her final appearance, trying to hurl a huge boulder onto the approaching vehicle. How nice of her. While cackling, "Goodbye, dearies!" That was bad, but anyway, with the voice of Ginny Tyler. As the boulder was about to drop and the vehicle didn't have a visible escape route, a pair of crash doors opened a path into a dark tunnel. The vehicle plunged into an almost complete darkness, accompanied by the witch's terrifying death scream. The original movie version scream by Lucille Laverne, indicating the witch's plunge to her death. Suck it, witch. Another pair of crash doors inside the black tunnel led the vehicle to the unloading area. In 1959, improvements were made into the Snow White's Adventures ride. Yale Gracie and Rolly Crump led the team. By 1965, the ride had received a new witch voice provided by Disney legend Ginny Tyler, and by 1968, well, there you go, the vehicles had been replaced by two benched mine carts. Further smaller changes were made onto the original ride's interiors and its facade throughout the 1960s and 1970s, but the ride inside basically stayed the same until its extensive remodeling in the 1980s. When creating the Magic Kingdom, the Imagineers of Wed Enterprises didn't want to duplicate California's Fantasyland dark rides for Walt Disney World, but Walt's brother Roy O. Disney, who supervised the creation of Walt Disney World's first phase after Walt's death, insisted that the Walt Disney World dark rides were not to be rethemed to different movies. Thus, Snow White's Adventures, Peter Pan's Flight, and Mr. Toad's Wild Ride were duplicated. Instead of a Sleeping Beauty adventure, a Mary Poppins Flight, and a ride that would have centered around the wizard duel from The Sword and the Stone. When planning this version of the ride, quite a few different ideas were thrown around, but the idea to make this incarnation scarier than its California cousin would make a big difference. It would concentrate more on the witch's sudden appearances, loud noises, and darkness. The team who created the 1971 Snow White Dark Ride, including a young Tony Baxter, as well as Claude Coates. The original version of the ride opened as Snow White's Adventures on Magic Kingdom's opening day of October 1st, 1971. As in the Disneyland version, Snow White was not shown at all, and the riders are going through the attraction with her point of view. Although here, the dwarfs only showed up very briefly in one scene. The queue was similar to Tokyo Disneyland's current queue. It featured the dwarves' mine, with their cottage visible in the distance. Guests began by entering the castle, where they saw a side of the dwarf's cottage as "I'm Wishing" played in the background. Upon entering, with the queen watching in a nearby window, the guests saw a mirror, but not a magic one. The queen transformed into the witch by saying, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, I am the fairest one of all," and was seen at the cauldron preparing the poisoned apple. That queen sounded quite manly there. The riders then crashed through the dungeon walls and escaped through the forest, with the tree monsters and the crocodile logs bumping into the witch, who was on a boat. She's on a boat! Soon guests arrived in the dwarf's cottage to see the animals peering out at them. Even the animals are scary in this version. They then passed the dwarves, walking up the stairs to their room to investigate a frightening shadow. The witch was waiting in the doorway with the apple. Riders would then exit the cottage, back into the woods, and pass by two ominous vultures. The final scene was the diamond mine, where the witch appeared several more times. Her final appearance was on the top of a doorway, pushing an enormous jewel onto the riders. Riders would then enter a room full of flashing cartoon-like strobe lights, similar to the ones in Mr. Toad's Wild Ride, with the witches cackling echoing in their ears. So they basically died. Guests then disembarked. Ginny Tyler provided the voice of the witch in this version as well, while Mel Blanc, Paul Frees, Hal Smith, Hans Conried, and Dallas McKennon voiced of the dwarves. The character figures for this version represented the latest high class. La-di-da. This was where the witch and the seven dwarfs started really resembling their 1937 movie counterparts. However, the sculpture-like figures were not specific audio animatronics. They did not move their mouths when talking, nor wink their eyes. They were stationary figures which rotated, bended, or slid into view. There we go. Some figures may have had a head or an arm moving to and fro. It's easy to see that many children were petrified of this attraction, and parents were shocked it wasn't more child-friendly. This version had 7 appearances by the hag, and really steered away from telling the story of the film. As in Disneyland, a sign reading, "Beware the Witch," had to be placed in the queue to warn children and parents alike. Going back to Disneyland, in 1981, it was time to say goodbye to the original Snow White's adventures. Nearly everything of the old Fantasyland was bulldozed to the ground between December 1981 and the summer of 1982. The Snow White ride was the first casualty in December 1981. The new Snow White ride was built from scratch, even though some of the original track layout followed into the 1983 reincarnation. Over at the then upcoming Tokyo Disneyland Park, many attractions were based on their Disneyland or Magic Kingdom versions. It is largely based on the original Walt Disney World version. It begins in the castle, where the queen transforms into the witch, moving on to the dungeon and passing her on the boat. After going through the forest, guests enter the cottage, and instead of seeing the dwarfs passing up the stairs seeing the shadow, the 7 dwarfs are doing the dwarfs' yodel song, with Snow White actually appearing in the ride, watching from the stairs. Exiting the cottage, guests find the witch outside waiting for them. Then enter the mines, which becomes a mix of both rides. They approach the cottage again to find the witches once again waiting. The ride ends with the dwarfs and the witch on the cliff. This version opened on Tokyo Disneyland's opening day of April 15, 1983. The Snow White ride in California's Disneyland was remodeled under the direction of Tony Baxter and a team of Imagineers of WED Enterprises. Snow White's Adventures was expanded as much as the very restricted space allowed. Some of the original track layout was used, but also 100 feet of additional track was installed into the new ride building. It is strongly believed that the Tokyo version of the Snow White ride was developed simultaneously with the new California version. The two rides share several identical scenes, sets, figures, and atmosphere. Most of the character figures in the 1983 version remodeled ride were based on the 1971 Walt Disney World figures. The music-making 7 dwarves in the ride opening scene had roots in Walt Disney World's Mickey Mouse Revue, also from 1971. It still used the ride vehicles, traveling on the familiar single-rail guide track that provided much of the important cinematic motion into the scary adventure. Traveling on the familiar single-rail guide track. The vehicles were basically the same double-benched models which had premiered in the late 1960s. While the ride still used the heroine's perspective, a sculpted stationary figure of Snow White was added to this new Disneyland version as well. Another huge change was the facade of the ride, where guests would now enter through the Queen's castle. If you look up at the window of the supposed castle, you can see a figure of the evil Queen open the curtains and peer out at you with a lemon-sucking scowl. When entering the queue, look out for the metal gold-colored apple that's within the reach of guests. Touching the apple causes the disembodied voice of the Queen to cackle menacingly. This new version of the ride opened at Disneyland on May 23, 1983. After entering the queue, riders wind their way through a dungeon inside the castle, passing by a book of poisons. The book reads, "One taste of the poison apple and the victim's eyes will close forever in the sleeping death." Like the original, the boarding area is dominated by a large mural depicting characters from the movie. When guests board the ride vehicles, they enter the dwarf's cottage. Here the music and yodeling from the Silly Song can be heard. Guests pass Snow White's, followed by some of her animal friends climbing the stairs to the second floor of the cottage. The guests then move past the dwarves who are performing the Silly Song. Riders soon leave the cottage, then pass by the Queen, who says, "Soon I'll be the fairest in the land." They then enter the dwarf's diamond mine, which is full of jewels of many colors. Jewels of many colors. Guests pass under a branch where the two vultures perched on it and enter the Queen's castle. There they see the Queen as she stands before her magic mirror with her reflection saying, "Magic mirror on the wall." She then turns and faces the guests. They see that she has become an ugly hag. "With this disguise, I'll fool them all," she adds. This effect is achieved by two models, one queen and one hag rotating on different sides of the mirror, which is actually a sheet of transparent glass. Projections and LED lights create the effect of cobwebs and electricity running through the walls. Guests continue to pass through the castle laden with skeletons. Nearby, the hag is accompanied by a raven in a dungeon where she is creating a poison apple for Snow White. She heads for the dwarf's cottage in a small... Riders wind their way through the dark forest. Here trees have ugly faces and branches like talons or grasping hands. Bats fly everywhere and logs resemble snapping crocodiles. The guests then turn towards the Seven Dwarfs' cottage. The door opens to reveal the hag, who offers the guests the apple. And of course we say, "Suck it, Queenie." Suck it, hag. Guests turn toward a mountainside where the dwarfs pursue the Queen. Nearby, the Queen tries to roll a boulder down the mountain to crush the dwarves below. However, a strike of lightning causes her to tumble to her death. Her scream is heard as guests exit the area where the vehicle passes a giant book featuring a silhouette of Snow White and her prince with his horse as they wander away towards a castle. The words at the bottom of this picture read, "And they lived happily ever after." One big change in the ride had to do with the Queen's apple. When the witch offered guests the poison apple, riders tried and sometimes managed to steal the apple and bring it home as a souvenir. And you know Disney doesn't allow any free souvenirs. They solved this problem of the ever-missing poisoned apple by replacing it with an image of an apple projected by means of a parabolic mirror. Guests who reach out to steal the apple now find their hands passing through it. Fooled you! It would then be known as Snow White's Scary Adventures as it is today after opening in the new version. Eventually, another new international park known as Disneyland Paris would open, Disneyland Paris as it's known today, Euro Disney was what it was called back in the day. Snow White's Scary Adventures would also find its way into that park. The ride is basically the same as the current Disneyland version. The only real difference is a happier ending can be found. All the dwarfs, the prince, and Snow White are on an ark. They still are, with Snow White sitting on the prince's horse and waving the guests goodbye. On the left side of the guests, the prince's castle is seen above the clouds. The ride is also called Blanche Neige et la Sept Nyons, which is, which is French for Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Disneyland wasn't the only version of the ride to receive a major overhaul, though. After petrifying kids for decades, a less scary version of the ride was planned, and it would be more similar to the new Disneyland version with a few scenes in different order. The redesigned ride took some cues from the version at Disneyland Paris, including increasing the ride capacity of each ride vehicle from 4 to 6 passengers. On October 14, 1994, the Disney World attraction was closed in order to undergo a redesign. The attraction reopened on December 16, 1994 as Snow White's Scary Adventures. Funny enough, with a much lighter tone. Guests boarded the ride by a mural depicting the characters of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs and began their ride in the Queen's courtyard, where Snow White was seen working outside and saying, "I'm wishing for the one I love." The Queen watched her and the riders, thanks, creep, from her window. Inside the castle, the scene was similar to the Disneyland version, with the Queen turning into the witch and working at the cauldron. Although the magic mirror was added, who said, "Alas, Snow White is the fairest one of all." To which the Queen replied, "Never!" The ride continued into the forest, where the huntsman, a newly added character in this version, tells Snow White to run away, and strobe lighting effects then resembled lighting, lit up Snow White running through the tree monsters, and then into the dwarf's cottage, where the dwarf's yodel song played. In a new scene, the riders then passed the witch giving Snow White the apple, then emerged from the cottage as she gloated that she was the fairest one of all. From there, guests rode through the mine, where the two of the dwarves, Sleepy and Sneezy, led by Doc, called them to stop the witch. After the scene where the witch tried to drop a rock on the dwarves, there was a new ending with the prince waking Snow White and then leading her away on the horse as two of the dwarves waved goodbye. Dopey was seen above the bridge waving to all the passengers. Guests then traveled to the open doors under the bridge and disembarked. As part of the new Fantasyland expansion of the Magic Kingdom, the attraction closed on May 31st, 2012. The space is now used as the Princess Fairy Tale Hall. The figures of Doc, Sleepy, Happy, Bashful, and Grumpy from the cottage sequence in the 1994 ride were recycled for the final scene in the Seven Dwarfs Mine Train attraction, along with the audio-animatronic vultures, which are perched above the first lift of the mine train. While a drastically different Snow White ride is now in Florida, you can at least see the more classic versions at the other parks. Snow White's Scary Adventures has gone through many different changes throughout the years, but still remains a Fantasyland must. Yes, I do always gotta ride Snow White's Scary Adventures. I'm upset I missed out on that original Walt Disney World version because I watched it on YouTube, and that was little. Well, I 8-year-old me is not upset that I missed that, because I probably would have been petrified and peed my pants. But look on YouTube for that original Walt Disney World version if you've never seen it, because it is like a house of horrors. And I can't believe that that was a Disney ride. It's much scarier than the Haunted Mansion would be. So, yeah, I'm sure there was not a lot of happy parents and children coming off that ride, and that's how it earned the reputation it got. And I know many people are still scared of that ride today. I did get to ride the other version at Walt Disney World before it closed quite a few times, and I always enjoyed that ride. It was like, it was sort of like a classic, so you had to go on it. And I just got to ride the Disneyland version 2014. I think I've ridden it like 3 times that vacation, and then like 3 times last year when I went to Disneyland. I actually enjoyed the Disneyland version more for some odd reason than the Walt Disney World version, but I will get to be comparing that some other time. I don't know. I just sort of dig it more. But it's basically the same, but they're just different order scenes or whatnot. Anyway, so if you want to ride the original Snow White ride, well, not original, but you know what I mean, kind of, the 1983 version at least, Disneyland still has it, and I enjoy it. I love yelling at the witch. You just gotta yell sometimes. Just yell stuff at the witch, and it makes it entertaining. As you see in my videos, I yell stuff at her. It just makes it fun. Or just go, "No, Snow White, don't take the apple." Stuff like that. The Tokyo versions and the Paris versions look a lot like the Disneyland version. And we'll talk about the Seven Dwarfs Mine Train on another episode of HitchHiking Hosts 101 in the very, very, very distant future, as we're only in 1955, and this is 2014, that ride opened. But I really actually enjoy the Snow White ride more than the Seven Dwarfs Mine Train. But as again I said, we'll talk about that later. But yeah, Snow White's Scary Adventures has really gone through quite a bunch of drastic changes over the years, as you can see. And it's funny because you can usually get on it pretty fast at Disneyland still, because there's lots of kids are scared of this ride yet, and its reputation is still around to be scary. So it's great if it's a hot day and every other ride has like an hour wait. You can normally, if it's a busy day, you'll have to wait a little bit, but it's a manageable line, much like Pinocchio is. But if it's not busy, you can usually wait like 5 minutes, if that, and then you can get on. It's a quick ride. So that's why it's always one of my favorites, because it's like, oh look, everything's getting busy. Let's go ride Snow White, you know? So I always usually save it for like the mid-afternoon or whenever anything's busy. So that is Snow White Scary Adventure. Alright, well that's all the time for this episode. Until next time, I'll be back with another Hitchhiking Host Show 101 soon. We're going to keep going with another Fantasyland attraction, Peter Pan's Flight. So, until then, and of course I'll be back every week with a new Hitchhiking Host Show, giving you all the trending topics going on at the Disney park. So be sure to come back and check those out too. Until next time, don't forget to subscribe right here on YouTube. youtube.com/HitchHostShow. You can like the show on Facebook, facebook.com/HitchHostShow. Follow on the Twitter and the Instagram at HitchHostShow. And if you're listening to the show or want to listen to the show, you can do it on Podbean. It's podbean.com/HitchHostShow. Or you can download it on iTunes or Stitcher. Until next time, don't forget to for the next episode. See ya.